And now we're immediately switching to English because our today's presentation will be held in English. In Sunday seminar series, we're trying to cover a broad range of issues, but obviously we stay close to our core mandate, which is to teach, study, and advance knowledge about the Holocaust, the Nazi mass murder of the Jews. And so if you look at the program, a bit of a advertisement, next Sunday we'll have Christopher Harper. We'll be talking about confiscation of Jewish assets during Second World War, unndragning av jødens formue under okkupasjon og rettsoppgjør. And then the next immediately after, on Monday, 4th of April, Terry Emberland will be talking about anti-Semitism in interwar Norway. Antisemitism i norsk mellomkrigstid. That will be in our Venningsforening, or Friends of the HL Senteret. Thank you. But today we'll be going outside of Norway, all the way south to Greece. Very important but very little known page of the Holocaust. There are many contested issues involved, specifically, as we just spoke with our speaker, the role of Italian and Spanish consulate in Saloniki, where the largest and, as far as I know, the oldest Jewish community existed. And so it's probably not surprising that our speaker today also comes from Italy. Stefania Zezza has been teaching languages and history at Vergilio High School in Rome. And she's also loosely affiliated with Roma Tre University, if I pronounce it correctly. Her interest is very much in linguistics. She worked closely with survivors' testimonies, and specifically what happened in Salonika under the Nazi occupation during Second World War, which is also the subject of her master's thesis, which she's about to deliver, I think, at the end of March. So she told me she will continue working on her thesis on the plane back home tomorrow. Otherwise, at Vergilio High School, she is in running all sorts of public projects and programs related to the Holocaust. So I think her profile dealing with secondary education and also academic research is very interesting for us. So I guess without further ado, I give the floor to Stefania Zezza, please.
For inviting me. The title, that was the title. This is the subtitle of my dissertation, my paper today, because Piedras que avlan is a Ladino expression. I talk about that later. Before beginning my talk, I would like to explain why I've chosen this topic. The Holocaust was an event whose extent was unique from a geographical, chronological, and ethical perspective. Its uniqueness mainly consists in its being a limit, a border between what the world was before and what it was after 1945. Mankind realized that the usual moral, historical, judicial categories of interpretation of reality had to be changed and extended. How to deal with something which also lacked of a name. Actually, the term genocide didn't exist before the 1940s. A new word had to be coined to depict the complex phenomenon which represents still nowadays a challenge for historians, scholars, and researchers who fight against the oblivion and the annihilation of the Jewish presence in Europe the Nazis had planned. This is particularly true in the case of the Salonikan Jewish community, a long-forgotten subject which only in the last decades has been specifically studied. Yes. and it's gaining the attention it deserves. The largest Sephardi community in Europe, which in the 1940 census numbered about 49,000 people, consisted of only about 2,000 in 1945, as it appears in the archival documents of the Joint Distribution Committee. The percentage of losses was about 90% in Salonika, similar to that of Poland. What had been called the Jerusalem of the Balkans had almost vanished. It became, as the historian Mark Matzover states, a city of ghosts. Since the Nazis aimed at erasing and eliminating the Jewish presence in Europe, then in Salonika they almost managed to achieve their goal. From this point of view, the meaning of the title, of the subtitle of my paper becomes clearer. Piedras que avlan, talking stones, was the expression in Ladino Judeo-Español, which was the title of an article published in 1929 in defense of the city's ancient Jewish cemetery, since the Salonikan municipality aimed at using the place for the university campus. The talking stones were the 500,000 tombstones, many of them dating back to the 16th century, which represented the history of the Salonikan Jewish community, and were removed from 1942 on. Salonika was under the German occupation at the time, and the area was handed over by the Jewish community to the Salonikan municipality as part of an agreement signed to ransom the Jews who were then being exploited as slave laborers by the Nazis. Being unable to collect 3.5 billion drachmas the Germans had requested, the community got a discount from the Germans' chief on military administration, Max Merten, who asked then that the destruction of the cemetery, whose land was estimated 1.5 billion drachmas, was part of the agreement. There is a document, this is the cemetery, after the destruction or during the destruction. There is a document we can read, written by the commander of Salonika and Aegean, where they say, the Jewish community of Salonika, these two in accordance with its earlier proposal, agreed to the payment of the total amount of 3.5 billion drachma. Of this amount, 2 billion drachmas will be obtained in cash by December 15, 1942, and will be used for the improvement of the catering for the Greek workers, replacing the Jews at their former workplaces. The religious community of Salonika will make the remaining 1.5 billion drachmas available for the Jewish cemetery. The cemetery, which is located inside Salonika, has up until now disturbed the organic structure of Salonika, and in any case must disappear so that public security and order can be maintained. This measure solves a problem that has vitally concerned the Greek public for many years. This has been written by the Department for Administration and Economy. Thus, the centuries-old testimony of the significant Jewish presence in Salonika began to vanish. This may symbolically represent the impending destruction of the Salonikan Jews, who were almost completely annihilated by the Nazis in 1943. As David Saltiel, a Greek researcher, pointed out in a recent study, the destruction of the cemetery tested the relations between the German military authorities, the Greek authorities, and the Jewish community on the eve of the deportation. This is a memorandum written by Dr. Cecil Roth, the reader of Jewish studies at the University of Oxford, where he said, and I don't read everything, but I can quote just the end of the document. It is in the Joint Distribution Committee archive. I have not dealt here with the legal or moral problem involved in the removal of stones of a later period put there in our own generation by persons who are now living or who perished in the Nazi gas chambers. During its history, the city had hosted the largest Sephardi community in Europe, as I told, which constituted the majority of Salonikan inhabitants for centuries and shaped the features of the city itself. When the Germans occupied the city on April 9, 1941, the Jews who were living in Salonika constituted the great majority of the about 70,000 or more Jews then living in whole Greece. It's important to underline that the Salonikan Jews, who had been subjects of the Ottoman Empire in the previous 4 centuries, began then to be Hellenized. The Holocaust Salonikan survivors were actually, after the war, the remnants of the lost world, quite different from the Ashkenazi Jewry from Northern and Eastern Europe. For many reasons, though, the destruction of Salonikan Jewry represents a significant topic worth being closely investigated in the perspective of a deeper understanding of the Holocaust in Europe, since it may be considered both peculiar and at the same time paradigmatic of the implementation of the final solution under many respects. Like other communities tragically affected by the Nazis' persecution, the Salonikan one underwent all the stages of the annihilation process, although in a shorter time, with an extremely significant outcome on the city's original aspect and its present physiognomy as a result. After a long silence in the Holocaust historiography, the interest towards the Sephardi communities affected by the final solution has recently risen, and many documents are now being examined, allowing a deeper understanding of the process of the annihilation of a large European Jewish community. The main purpose of this paper is to analyze the situation and the fate of the Salonikan Jews from 1941 to 1945, especially in the camps, considering that the process of destruction of Salonikan Jewry is only apparently similar to that of other communities. It actually shows up many specific features which make it definitely unique. The Jewish community in Salonika, which dated back to the 2nd century before Christ and was originally composed of Romaniotes, Greek-speaking Jews, was the result of the consecutive migration flows, also of Ashkenazi Jews from Germany, Hungary, Poland, and of Italian Jews. Actually, the most significant among these flows was the arrival of several thousand Sephardim from Spain and Portugal at the end of 15th and 16th century. These Jews had been expelled by the Catholic Spanish kings as a consequence of the Reconquista, and were welcomed by the Sultan, by Yazid II, in the port city, then part of the Ottoman Empire. They deeply affected and shaped the community's features. They had brought with them their Spanish habits and the Ladino language, which they spoke as their first language up until the 20s at least. The use of speaking Ladino played a significant role during the Holocaust, because the older people speaking only Ladino could not hide among the Greek-speaking Orthodox population. On the other hand, as we'll see later, it became a sign of the Salonikans' identity and fate inside the camps. Under the Ottoman rule, the Jews, which constituted for a long time the majority of the city's population, were allowed to maintain their habits and language. They also led and enriched Salonika's social, cultural, and economical life. In order to understand and interpret properly what happened to Salonika Jewry during the implementation of the final solution, it is necessary to remember at least 4 events which had significant consequences on the community. In 1912, Salonika was annexed to the Greek reign, which carried out immediately an Hellenization process that significantly affected the Salonikan Jewish condition and way of life. The youngest generation learned Greek, which became compulsory at school, while their parents kept on speaking Ladino or spoke Greek with a recognizable accent. In August 1917, a Greek fire burnt the greatest part of the Jewish neighborhoods. Its impact was so catastrophic that in 1943, on the eve of the deportation, half of the Jewish population was still living in misery in the accommodation which the Joint Distribution Committee had provided. You can see an image. Another fundamental event whose effect in Salonikan Jewry was irreversible and crucial was the arrival of thousands of Orthodox Greeks from Turkey, Anatolia, as a result of the population exchange established by the Lausanne Treaty in 1923. This population exchange brought about a dramatic outcome on Jews' habits and conditions in the second half of the 20s. Saturday, for example, which had been the day of repose for centuries, became a working day and was substituted by Sunday, so they had to close the shops for 2 days. Anti-Semitism spread in the city and led eventually to a pogrom, the Campbell riots in 1931. For this reason, consistent emigration flows increased, as it had already happened in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. About 10,000 Salonikan Jews went to Palestine, many others to France. The choice of this last destination, it was chosen because the Alliance Israélite Universelle had established many schools in the port city in Salonika. This was one of the reasons. Many Salonikans were later deported from France, in particular from Drancy. Their names can be found in the lists of deportation to Auschwitz. Actually, in November 1942, a roundup was carried out in Paris, and it was called La Rafle de Grec, because it involved the immigrants from Salonika, Greece, and the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. On the other hand, several Jews held or could claim for foreign citizenship or status as Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian protégés, as a consequence of previous agreements, some dating back to the 17th century, or laws passed in Spain and Portugal. This situation was crucial during the deportations. The exemplarity of what happened in Salonika and to the Salonikan Jews lays on the fact that the different steps in the implementation of the final solution, that is identification, exploitation of slave labor, and seizure of Jewish properties, exclusion, ghettoization, and deportation, followed the same steps as in other countries, although at a much faster pace. The anti-Jewish policy, in fact, was mainly carried out in about 1 year, from July 1942 to August 1943. But the last 3 steps were developed in only 5 months after Dieter Wislitzny and Alois Brunner were sent by Eichmann to Salonika in February 1943. The Germans occupied Salonika on April 9, 1941, as a result of their intervention in support of the Italians, who had declared war against Greece in October 1940. Greece was divided in 3 occupation zones. The Italians ruled over Athens, the mainland at the Dodecaneso, the Bulgarians occupied part of Thrace and Eastern Macedonia, the Germans, Crete, part of Crete, Salonika and its hinterland. This division of the Greek territories affected deeply the implementation of the final solution, since the occupants showed different attitudes toward the Jews. When the Germans entered the city, the Jews constituted about a quarter of the total population. Most of them were lower-class people who, together with the rest of the city, had fought against and suffered during the war against Italy. Even though specific and harsh persecution measures were not carried out during the first year of occupation, the Salonikan Jews were deeply affected by the German occupation policy and the consequent famine they had to endure during the winter 1941-1942. The events of this first phase of the occupation, which lasted from April 1941 to July 1942, can be reconstructed also on the basis of 2 extremely significant testimonies written by members of the Salonikan Jewish community. The accounts written by Yom Tov Yakoel, which was presented as a document at the Eichmann trial, and the report written by Dr. Isaac Matarasso immediately after the war. Being the lawyer of the community, Yakoel was involved in the events and could examine them clearly. He fled to Athens in March 1943 and was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in March 1944. From their words, it's possible to understand that Jews' conditions were harsher than the rest of the population due to their poverty and to the confiscation policy they had to endure. Yet, in April, the members of the Jewish Community Council were arrested. The chief rabbi, Tzvi Koretz, a Galician Jew, was sent to Vienna. Anti-Semitic groups tried to boycott the Jewish commercial activities. The Jews were forced to hand over their radios, their newspapers were closed. Nevertheless, in Yacuel's word, these had the character of isolated acts perpetrated by certain agencies or by certain German military personnel. No programmatically defined anti-Semitic policies were revealed by the German authorities during the first 15 months of occupation. That's what Yacuel said. The confiscation policy was implemented also against the Christian population. The difference was that any measure was taken against Jews first. What deeply affected the Jews at this time was the activity of the Sonderkommando Rosenberg, which arrived to Salonika on June 12, 1941, with the purpose of gathering artifacts, ancient manuscripts, sacred texts, precious objects. These were then sent to what had to become Frankfurt's new library for the exploration of the Jewish questions. From the testimony of Isaac Nehama at the Eichmann trial, every day there was something new. Next one had to hand in the pianos. Most Jews owned pianos, and every Jew had to give up his piano. Then the telephones. Jews were forbidden to use the telephone. It had to be handed over to the company. One day, 3 trucks arrived and took the complete library of holy books which we had in the community. Books from before the time the Jews left Spain. Our rabbis cried so much when they took those books. I remember it to this day. I recall the tears of this learned man who said, "Nothing matters to us, only these books." The Germans had been studying and collecting information on Greek Jewry at least from 1938. They received information from German diplomats and were aware of the differences between the various communities as well as their figures. The Salonikan Jews, treated as Yacuel stated with indifference, thought that no further step would have been taken. They had not the exact perception of what was going on elsewhere. Some of them who had fled to Athens went back to Salonika at that time. The second phase of the occupation was that of the open persecution. It began on July 11, 1941, when No, that's not the image. Okay. When 9,000 Jews were gathered in Liberty Square, Plata Eleftheria, to be registered as forced laborers. They were forced to stay under the sun and perform physical exercises all day while they were being beaten and humiliated. Many of them fell ill. Some died in the following days as a consequence of the mistreatments. This event deeply affected the public opinion for the useless cruelty and the lack of humanity showed by the Germans. At the same time, some anti-Semitic newspapers supported the operation. From the testimony of Isaac Nehama at the Eichmann trial, I tell you, an order had been given to form lines without moving, and the sun was very strong, and the Jews were not able to stand in the sun for a long time. It was July in Greece. But they were so slow making their arrangements that many could not stand it. They also wanted to have fun. They did it for laughs. When they were in a certain row, an SS policeman would come and push them away and start hitting and fooling around. And at the windows there were Germans taking photos of them and applauding. About 7,000 Jews were enlisted as forced laborers and were sent to work on roads and airfields under construction in several areas of Macedonia in the following weeks. Their conditions were extremely harsh. They lacked of food, shelter, suffered from malaria and other diseases. The death rate was quite high. The Jewish Council had to help their families and provide them with food, clothes, and money. As a result, the community elders signed the agreement for the release of the forced laborers, which implied also the destruction of the ancient cemetery. These workers went back to Salonika in early November 1942. The implementation of the final solution began in February 1943 and was carried out very quickly. Many sources can help in reconstructing the events and pointing out the peculiarities of the situation in Salonika. On the one hand, the usual measures as elsewhere were applied. On the other, given the peculiar features of the Salonikan Jewry, there were evident specificities which influenced the efficacy and the rapidity of the deportation, the selection of the people to be deported, and their destination. The testimony written by Yom Tov Yacoel Matarasso provide important information about the Jewish approach to the persecution and deportation of the Salonikan Jewry, expressing different points of view on the behavior of the Jewish Council and its president Zvi Koretz. Important information can be found also in the scripts of the trials against Dieter Wislitzny, Adolf Eichmann and Max Merten, who were in charge of the operation in Salonika. Eichmann sent Dieter Wislitzny and Alois Brunner to Salonika in order to carry out the deportation of the Salonikan Jews on February 6, 1943. They worked together with Max Merten, the head of the city's military administration, who signed the orders. From that day on, the Nuremberg laws were imposed on the city. The Jews were obliged to register themselves and their properties, which were confiscated or looted, to wear the yellow star and move to the ghettos established in the cities, obeying a curfew. On February 25th, all the Salonikan Jews, except those exempted because they had Spanish or Italian citizenship or Portuguese, were concentrated in specific areas of the city. From a report by the German consul in Salonika, February 26, 1943, the ghettoization was implemented in such a way that Jews were forced to take up apartments in two large quarters of the city, which until now had been inhabited almost exclusively by Jews. One of these areas is situated in the western part of the city, the other in the eastern part. While the Jewish stores that are located outside the two ghettos may be maintained, they must be marked with a placard bearing the inscription Hebraikon Katastema, Jewish stores. The main area of concentration was Baron Hirsch neighborhood, in the proximity of the rail station. The Jews were gathered there at the time of the deportation. As soon as a train was loaded with, on average, 2,500 people, other Jews were forced into the ghetto transit camp from the other concentration areas, Regi Vardar, Cala Maria, and number 151. The establishment of ghettos in Salonika was a rather unique event in Western Europe. Only in Amsterdam, Hungary, and northern Romania, ghettos were established. In other occupied countries, the Jews were concentrated in transit camps or arrested in their places of residence. The Baron Hirsch ghetto was sealed off and fenced in early March. The deportations began on March 15, 1943. Some reflections. The greatest majority of the Salonikan Jews were deported. Why the deportation could be carried out so easily? Firstly, the Salonikan Jews didn't know much of what the Jews were suffering in other occupied countries. The Jewish Council and Rabbi Koretz, a controversial figure in historiography, believed what the Germans told them about a resettlement of the community in Krakow and obeyed the orders. Actually, they had to face these tragic moments and their internal disputes, being in a condition of choiceless choice. They didn't understand the gravity of the situation unless it was too late, also because no warning signs had been sent to them from abroad. Some of the Salonikan Jews also changed their money in zlotys, converting them in checks signed by the Germans and addressed to the bank in Krakow. Others bought new work tools to work in Poland. Gradually, the information about the harsh treatment of the deportees during the transport spread, and some Jews managed to flee to the mountains or the Italian occupation zone. Some others had already left the city, but very few of them eventually avoided deportation. Secondly, the close family ties prevented many youngsters from escaping. If they had wanted, they could have tried to hide among the Christians more easily than their older parents or relatives, since they could speak Greek with no Ladino accent. One of the peculiarities of the situation of Salonikan Jews lies in a different treatment of residing Jews owning a foreign citizenship, foreign nationals. According to German sources, about 800 Jews with foreign citizenship lived in Salonika at the time of the first transport. They were exempted from the anti-Jewish measures and initially avoided the deportation. An interesting testimony on this situation is provided by the diary of Captain Lucillo Merci, the interpreter of Guelfo Zamboni, the Italian consul in Salonika at the time, and this is it's in Yad Vashem. He donated his diary to Yad Vashem. It's in its archive. Guelfo Zamboni, the consul, is Writers Among the Nations now. The work of Daniele Carpi, archival documents in Italian and Spanish administration. The Italian consul Guelfo Zamboni, until June 1943, provided documents demonstrating the Italian citizenship to many Jews. So the number of the Italian citizens and of those who were allowed to flee to the Italian occupation zone increased. Yet previously, many problems had arisen between the Germans and the Italians about the implementation of the anti-Jewish measures also in the area under the Italian rule. Many documents can demonstrate this attitude, which consisted in providing Italian papers quite largely. As a matter of fact, Zamboni and his successor, Castruccio, managed to avoid or at least to delay the deportation to Auschwitz of 3,050 Italian Jews who arrived to Athens on July 19, 1943. The Spanish nationals who lived in Salonika were mostly protected from the immediate deportation. An agreement with Franco's government allowed the Jews to enter Spain only temporarily. About 300 of them were deported to Bergen-Belsen, established originally as an exchange camp on August 2nd, 1943. They were later freed and sent to Morocco. 78 members of the Jewish Council, among them Rabbi Tzvi Koretz and his family, were sent to Bergen-Belsen with the same transport. On August 10, 1943, the last transport with about 1,800 Jews who had been selected as forced laborers in March left the city. The following morning, the consul Castruccio wrote to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Jewish community of Salonika, which was founded before the discovery of America and which included around, he said, 60,000 members, exists no more. The liquidation of the Jewish community was carried out with the greatest atrocity, horrors, and crimes, such as never been seen before in the history of all times and of all people. After September 8th, day of the armistice, the Italian armistice, the Germans took control of the Italian zone, and many Jews, also Italian and Spanish nationals, who had escaped from Salonika due to the efforts also of the Spanish consul in Athens, Sebastian Romero Radigales, and the collaboration of the Italian authorities, were arrested there. They arrived to Auschwitz on April 10th and June 20th. Others were deported on March 25 to Bergen-Belsen, from where the former group of Spanish nationals had been sent to Spain and then to Casablanca. The Salonikan condition in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. From March 15 to August 1943, 19 transports, deporting on average 2,500 Jews each, left Salonika and arrived to Auschwitz, usually after about 5-7 days. The Salonikans had also to pay for their trip to death. Their tickets may be seen at the Auschwitz Museum. Here they are. Even though there are discrepancies in the figures of the deportees, from 45,000 to 48, however, the percentage of those immediately sent to the gas chambers was about 70-80%. Many among the few who were admitted into the camp died in the following weeks due to various reasons. This means that the number of the Salonikan inmates was extremely low in comparison to that of the prisoners coming from other countries. Nevertheless, they faced all the possible experiences in Auschwitz-Birkenau. This raises two important questions. Firstly, why such a great number of losses during the first selection and in the following weeks? Secondly, why, given the limited number, about 10,000, were the Salonikans present as the witnesses state or were involved in the multiplicity of experiences of the camp life? To answer the first question about the losses, it is necessary to underline that at the moment of their arrival in March-April, Crematorium 2 in Birkenau had been in function from 1 week. Crematorium 3 was under construction and began operating in June, thus the capacity of killing and disposing of the corpses had increased. The other main issue was that many transports from other countries were arriving to the Auschwitz complex at the same time, and the problem existed for housing new arrivals. Many Salonikan inmates were actually employed in the construction of part of Birkenau buildings. Another major issue was that, after the long trip from Greece to Poland, they were in terrible physical conditions, especially the older ones. They all had experienced an awful famine during the previous months. As a matter of fact, only few of them were selected to work. The youngest and the strongest people, a tiny percentage, about 20–30%. A common problem, both at the arrival and during their imprisonment, concerned the language. The Salonikan Jews were Sephardim, who spoke mainly Ladino and or Greek. Many of them could speak French and Italian, but usually they did not speak the most widely spoken languages in the camp: Polish, German, Yiddish. Therefore, they couldn't understand the orders or the suggestions whispered by the prisoners in charge of emptying the rail wagons, nor they could communicate easily with the majority of the prisoners. Yaakov Andeli said, Greek Jews suffered more than others. The second reason was the language barrier. Ashkenazi Jews who knew Yiddish could understand the Germans. We could not understand them and had trouble adapting to the climate. These two factors caused deaths among the Greek Jews from the beginning. Within 3 months of our arrival in Auschwitz, 50% of us were no longer alive. Once they had entered the camp, their relation with the Ashkenazi Jews were problematic. There was initially a sort of a misunderstanding and mistrust for a different form of Hebraism, not even perceived as such. They couldn't speak Yiddish. So they felt a kind of alienation, but at the same time, a strong connection among themselves and mutual support were born from the will to resist. According to the testimonies, also the difference between the Greek warm weather and the Polish cold climate played a significant role in the survival of the Salonikan Jews. The second question. The few Salonikans who had been selected for work experienced all the aspects, even the less common, of the life in the camp, which makes their fate quite paradigmatic in its peculiarity. From an overall perspective, they had to cope with diseases, hunger, the feeling of loss, the dehumanization process, as any other prisoner. But their condition of incommunicability and consequent alienation made it often more difficult for them to bear the harsh living conditions within the camp. As one of the survivors stated, we had to learn all the languages. We had to talk with our feet, with our eyes, and our hands. The situation brought about two apparently different images of the Salonikans in the survivors' accounts. On the one hand, they seemed apparently annihilated by the cold, the shock, and their sufferings. They died like flies, a witness states. On the other, the majority of the accounts, from Primo Levi's on, focused on their strength, their loyalty, their dignity, and ability, which made them recognizable as also in the forced anonymity of Auschwitz. An example of this unique situation can be that even though the Salonikans had linguistic difficulties, they influenced the unique and mixed language of the camp. As Primo Levi stated, the Greeks have been reduced to very few. by now, but they have made a contribution of the first importance to the physiognomy of the camp and to its international slang. Everyone knows that caravana is a Ladino word, is the bowl, and that la comodera es buena means the soup is good. The word that expresses the generic idea of theft is klepsi, from klepto, the verb in Greek, of obvious Greek origin. These few survivors from the Jewish colony of Salonika, with their two languages, Spanish and Greek, and their numerous activities, are the repositories of a concrete, mundane, conscious wisdom in which the traditions of all the Mediterranean civilizations blend together. That is, wisdom was transformed in the camp into the systematic and scientific practice of theft and seizure of positions, and the monopoly of the bargain market should not let one forget that their aversion to gratuitous brutality, their amazing consciousness of the survival of at least potential human dignity, made the Greeks the most coherent national nucleus in Lager, and in this respect the most civilized. It is extremely significant that the Greek or Ladino words which became common were related to the most important issues in the camp: food and survival. The black market and the skill in organizing actually made the difference between life and death. Language was also an important element on which the tasks imposed to the Salonikans depended. Many of them were transferred to the concentration lager Warsaw Geshovka in order to remove the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto and to collect all the building materials which were sent later to Germany. In July 1943, Himmler had made the decision to erase any traces left of the former ghetto in Warsaw and to set up a park in the area. Non-Polish-speaking prisoners, among them many Salonikans, were transported to Warsaw in late August. October and November 1943, they were chosen since they couldn't speak Polish. From a testimony, the transport was composed only for Greek people. The reason, because we don't speak Polish, and the job was in contact with the Polish civilians, and they don't want the Polish Jews. The Germans thought that the impossibility to communicate would have prevented the prisoners from escaping. As a matter of fact, the Salonikans managed to have contacts and to trade with the Poles. From the testimony, another thing that surprised me was that the Poles could communicate best with the Greek Jews, with whom they had developed a sign language. With the Polish Jews who spoke the same language, they avoided contact. Every day, 100 or so Poles would enter the ghetto to work at clearing away the ruins, and they all did business with the slaves of the Warsaw camp. They brought in food and carried off riches. The biggest merchants were the Greek Jews, most of whom came from Salonika. They were especially talented at organizing what they call klepsi, that is, articles from non-kosher sources, such as theory. In Geshovka camp, not only the Salonikans could see the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, but also experienced the first evacuation march on July 1944. While the Red Army was approaching Warsaw, the greatest part of the prisoners was evacuated to Dachau and its sub-camps. At the same time, the few who were left in the camp were liberated by the Polish resistance movement and willingly joined the partisans during the Warsaw Uprising. Some of them died, some others went in hiding and were liberated later by the Red Army. Also, those who stayed in the Auschwitz complex endured a peculiar fate. Many of them, men and women, in high percentages, were employed in Buna Monowitz or in the Auschwitz subcamps such as Jaworno, Hermedze, Gleiwitz, Fürstengruppe, where they are remembered as strong workers, or in the case of young girls, as aware of their fate and decently resigned victims of the hard conditions they had to cope with. Once again, the language proves to be a crucial element in the testimony about the Greeks in general and the Salonikans in particular. This language barrier could also have played a role in the selection of the Sonderkommando members at the eve of the arrival of the Hungarian Jews. Even though the operations which took place in the crematoria were quite known, many survivors stated that the Germans tried to keep the operation as secret as possible. Nevertheless, it is possible to suppose that the Greeks recently arrived unaware of the camp life, with evident language difficulties, were selected because they happened to be those who couldn't communicate with the Hungarian deportees. They became the means of the Nazis' usual deceiving attitude towards Jews, since their aim was to avoid any form of resistance. On the contrary, they managed to communicate, sometimes especially because they could speak Greek and Ladino. Marcel Najari, a Salonikan member of the Sonderkommando, talked in ancient Greek to a Hungarian professor in the undressing room of the gas chamber. An anonymous Greek sang with a loud voice a song in Greek from Crematorium 4. He wanted to be heard by the Canada Commando and let the prisoners there know what was happening. I only quote a part of this. I say, girls, Greeks who listen to me, I say everything by singing, so you will understand. Here the chimneys you see are the biggest factory of death. Thousands of Jews, old, young, children fall into the arms of the flames. I know they will burn me too. After a while I will not be around. If you get out of here alive, tell the entire world the story. I sing to you. Actually, many members of the 11th Sonderkommando were Greek, mostly from Salonika, who had been deported from Athens and arrived to Auschwitz on April 11, 1944. Those who survived the first selection were kept in quarantine, and about 200 of them were selected in early May to be part of the Sonderkommando, mainly in Crematoria 3 and 4. Several of them participated to the Sonderkommando revolt on October 7, 1944. Shlomo Venezia, the Gabbai brothers among them. Some of them managed also to survive Auschwitz and could later give their testimony on the event. The Germans were going to halve the number of the Sonderkommando members operating in the crematoria 4th and 5th. The revolt began when 300 prisoners, mostly Greeks and Hungarians, who had been previously selected, were gathered in the courtyard of Crematorium 4th. Several Greeks, many from Salonika, took an active part in the revolt. Among the writings buried by some Sonderkommando members in the proximity of the crematoria, there are also some pages written by Marcel Najari in November or December 1944. He was a Salonikan Jew whose manuscript was found in 1908, close to Crematorium 3. He said, "At Birkenau it does not matter to me that I will die, but only that I will not be able to revenge myself the way I will like and know." As a matter of fact, the time of arrival of the Salonikans, both in 1943 and in 1944, seemed to be one of the main elements to understand their fate inside the camp. This is true for what concerns the Sonderkommando selections and proves to be extremely significant also in relation to the high percentage of Salonikans subjected to medical experiments, in particular those on sterilization on women, conducted by Dr. Klauberg, and on men by Dr. Schumann in Block 10. The first 100 women who were taken there as guinea pigs were Salonikans, arrived with the 9 transport on April 17, 1943. Many others were added later. It was on April 1st, 1943 that Dr. Klauberg set up the experimental block in Block 10 in Auschwitz first, moving there from Birkenau. The high percentage of Salonikan victims, both young men and women, can therefore be explained through a chronological reason and also perhaps with a need of secrecy about the activities in the block. Undoubtedly, as Israel Jacobson, representative of the Joint Distribution Committee, said later, for some reasons the Germans chose the Greek Jewish women to experiment on. A dreadful episode can confirm this. Between August 11th and 1943, 86 Auschwitz prisoners, among them 46 Salonikan, about half, men and women, were murdered in a small gas chamber in Nitzweiler Struthof, and their corpses were sent to the anatomy laboratory of the Strasbourg University Medical School in order to be used for a Jewish skeletons collection. The director of the laboratory was Dr. Hirt. Although he was not a doctor, he taught at the university and asked Himmler some well-preserved bodies for his work. That's the reason why those Auschwitz prisoners whose biometric measures had been previously taken were sent to Natzweiler-Struthof and murdered. Their heads were removed, their bodies were cut and preserved. The story was kept secret until a German reporter, Dr. Lang, investigated and broke the silence about it. The names of the victims could be known since Henri Pierre, doctor's assistants, had written their registration numbers down. An official ceremony took place in December 25th, and finally a memorial plaque with the names of the victims was placed on the site where the rest had been buried. The visibility and the peculiarity of the Salonikan Jews, though, had also a different meaning. Also, almost finished. In the Auschwitz complex, where anonymity, indifference, and fight for survival prevailed, they were recognizable for their language, for their solidarity and mutual help. Primo Levi was the first to understand that, wrote, "Next to us there is a group of Greeks, those admirable and terrible Jews of Salonika, tenacious, thieving, wise, so determined to live, such pitiless opponents in the struggle for life. Those Greeks who have conquered in the kitchens and in the yards, and whom even the Germans respect and the Poles fear. They are often remembered by other survivors for their singing. A witness said, "What helped me in the camp was singing. The Germans always told us, singen, and we used to sing. We sang all sorts of songs. We made up the words. Some Salonikans joined also the orchestra. I want to remember only one last thing. There were two popular boxers, Shlomo Aruk and Yakorazon, who had to entertain the SS and the prisoners with their matches. Yakorazon, working in the kitchen, could help many of his fellow prisoners in Buna. They were later evacuated to Bergen-Belsen, where they managed to help the Greek girls in the women camp. It is necessary to remember that the Salonikans were deported also to Bergen-Belsen. Those with Spanish citizenship got there in August 1943 and in April 1944. They were treated as exchange Jews. They were kept in the camp and suffered from starvation, disease. Nonetheless, they were not subjected to selections and extermination by gas. They were liberated in April 1945, while they were being sent to Theresienstadt as a result of Himmler's attempts to find an agreement with the Allies. When the Salonikan survivors came back to their hometown, they found out that their world had been tragically affected. Their relatives had been murdered, their properties were not returned to them in spite of the restitution law issued by the Greek government. It was the first government to do that. And only about 2,000 Jews were in Salonika in December 1945, half of them extremely needy and homeless. Some of the survivors actually spent some time in Paris, inside the DP camps in Italy. The Joint Distribution Committee archives contains many documents, letters and reports regarding their conditions. Ovadia Baruch, one of the first survivors to come back, stated, "No one even wanted to look at us. Time had to pass, more survivors had to come back before the truth about the camps could be accepted. Many of them stayed silent, many of them emigrated. They escaped from the ghettos, many of them stayed. We, the Jews of Salonika, came back to a city empty of Jews and Judaism. Our only joy was to encounter another Jew in the street of Salonika, a surprise, an embrace, with Jews we had never met before, and an eagerness to inquire and weep together."
Thank you very much, Stefania Zezza, for telling this dramatic story so eloquently, let's say. I have quite a few questions to you, but first, of course, we should give a chance to the audience to ask a question or raise a brief comment, if you will. So please raise your hand. Whoever wants to ask a question or raise a comment, please. Wait.
By the time of the German occupation, was there any remnants of the converted Jewish community of the city? By that I mean
Maranos.
the followers of Sabbatai Sevi, who converted to
to Islam. Yes.
Originally from Smyrna.
Maybe not. Maybe they went to with exchange population to.
So they were already gone.
I don't know exactly, but I
that
think
would
so.
have presented an interesting challenge for the German occupiers.
Yeah.
Any other questions, please? You're a bit hesitant.
Yeah, I'm a little bit hesitant because.
Please take it.
Thank you. What I think was so easy to exterminate the Jewish because they are so loyal to the governments of the country where they are living. They are not like the Muslims. For example, I was in Holland. There are old Sephardi Portuguese synagogue.
Yeah.
And until today, they pray in Ladino to the kings of Portugal before they was expelled from Portugal. So what they pray for the kings to have a long life and God keep them in life is not the case of Muslims. They never pray in any country for the loyalty to the governments. They have another loyalty, how to implement their own rules in every country where they become the majority. So I think maybe this is one of factors why the Jews are so easy to be exterminated. Because they hear the leaders of the community, they were very peaceful people, they never think to fight against the government, but to obey the rules in each country where they was living.
Yeah. It's quite a complex.
I think I'm just going to take it back. I think when we were having a lecture on the terrible legacy of racism and prejudice, I'm very saddened to hear your own prejudice. And I think I'm going to leave the lecture. And I will leave you with your conscience to look at the lessons of history, particularly the horrible Holocaust, and find the strength and the moral courage within yourself to heal your prejudices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But I guess we still stick to what Stefania told in her presentation.
I'm sorry.
You have a comment on this one?
I do not agree very much because they were not about the loyalty, absolutely. They were extremely loyal. I think it was a matter of something that could never be imagined. It was so far from any category of their thoughts. They couldn't imagine what was going on. So, and also the Jewish Council. I think it's, even though Zvi Koretz was a controversial figure because in historiography many seem to attack him and many others are defending him. There are recent studies about his role during the occupation and the deportation. It would have happened the same. The Germans were the occupying force, so they could do what they wanted. Of course, and the loyalty and the obedience to the orders, the fact that they were maybe conscious of the fact that they were, if they obeyed, maybe they would stop the persecution. So no further paces would have been taken against them because they couldn't imagine what was without precedents. It was unprecedented reality. It was an unprecedented event in history. They couldn't imagine something like that. So I think it's more like this perspective should be seen.
Any further questions, please? Yeah.
I just want to ask, what did the Jews of Saloniki found out when they came back to Saloniki after the war?
Yeah.
I know the stories about Norway, but what did they found after the war in Saloniki? And if you can say How is the Jewish community doing today in Saloniki? What's going
Oh,
on
today there is a Jewish community, there is a museum, there is an archive. They are working very hard. I should go there soon to visit. When they came back, I told at the end, I tried to cut my talk. When they went back, they were absolutely destroyed because the community was such a large community, and they found there were so few remnants. And the people had difficulties to understand what they had had been through. And that's why many of them married. There were a lot of weddings, also in the displaced persons camp, and they emigrated. And they found difficult to live in a city which had been completely changed by the occupation time during the war. And some of them stayed there and they lived there, and there are some, I think, some survivors still now. Jaco Rozon died recently, but he was not there. And there are testimonies about the situation in the archives of the Joint Distribution Committee, and they had to provide them with everything because there was a law issued by the government, the Greek government, but it was very difficult to make it real. I can, if you want, if you like, I can read to you the text of this is a summary of an article of April 5th, 1945. We have before us a number of letters from Jews who miraculously escaped annihilation by the German monsters, which deal with the questions of their property and belongings in Salonika. This question was created as a result of the mass deportation of the Jewish element by the Germans. Jewish property was confiscated and turned over to the Greek state for liquidation and administration. The government even issued a special law, number 205, to cover the situation. The Germans, however, have gone, and the Jews that had survived through the protection of Greek families from the hell in Poland now request that their property be returned to them. The only answer that they get to their endeavors, write Mr. Erga from Salonika, is promises and more promises. Following which he asks, and we also ask, when will these promises materialize? They were materialized mostly during time, because there was a civil war in Greece after the war, after the Second World War. So it was a difficult moment.
They were not very welcome.
And
they were not welcome so much.
From the testimonies, if you read the testimonies, they didn't feel like that, but they were very traumatized. They were extremely suffering. And that's what in the Joint Distribution Committee's archives we can find.
Yeah, there's one question.
Did you mention how many thousand that were sent to Poland?
About 40,000, but the figures are very different in the sources. So about 48, 49, 45,000.
If I may have about two and a half questions.
Yeah.
Good question, but if you could answer in short, briefly. First, deportation commenced in February 1943.
In March. Yeah.
1943. So, put in the context of the Holocaust, looking from a German perspective, it's relatively late.
Yeah.
It's almost 2 years after the Nazi occupation of Germany.
Yeah.
So can you sketch for us this German decision-making leading up to the deportation? Why in March 1943?
But I think, well, as the sources and the historiography states, maybe there were logistical reasons, and in the Balkans, and there was the Serbia events in Serbia and former Yugoslavia, and I think they had to organize the things better, and they were the Italians too, and Greece was occupied by 3 countries. They began from the Bulgarian zone in the days before, and then went after, they began in Salonika in March. It was relatively late, but and it was late also from the Italian occupation zone, but there was a reason, because they, I think it can be explained for the situation in the Balkans from a kind of division of energy and forces.
Thank you. And my second, more of a comment on the challenge you bit on the issue of ghetto in Salonika, because you put it within the context of Western Europe. You said it was very kind of not unique, but one of the few cases, Budapest, Northern Romania. But I would say if you look in Eastern Europe, of course, where it was the largest concentration of Jews, Łódź, Warsaw, Vilna, Riga, actually there were quite a few ghettos. In that respect, also all the controversy surrounding that Rabbi Tzvi Koretz, as you mentioned briefly, again, putting in a larger context of the Holocaust, I mean, his behavior, how it was evaluated, how he behaved, tried to save the Jews, but delivering some of the Jews, again, probably wasn't so unique. Looking at the Jewish elders, again, in places like Łódź, Warsaw, and Vilna.
Yes, the problem was he came from abroad. He was a Galician Jew. He was not from Salonika, and he was not accepted well from the beginning, and he spoke German. He had studied in Germany, so maybe there was a kind of he was looked at with attention. They paid attention to what he did, and I think he found himself in the same condition as other Jewish council leaders in everywhere. The establishment of the ghetto, it was Baron Hirsch can be called a ghetto. The other concentration areas in Salonika, they were not ghettos. It was quite a unique event in Western Europe, as we said. Perhaps because there was the public opinion played a significant role in countries like France or Italy, because the ghettos in Italy are different. They have a different meaning. They were the original ancient ghetto, not the Nazi ghettos. We had ghettos, but they were different. So yes, it's quite a different situation.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I wondered, I want to ask knowledge about genocide on the Armenian population in Turkey in 1915.
Yeah.
What was the spreading of knowledge about that later in the century?
I cannot answer to that. I'm sorry. The knowledge in Salonika about the Armenian.
Yeah, I mean, you said it was unimaginable. So I was thinking.
Because it. Yes, okay. Yes, I understand. It's kind of different. There are differences between the two events. I think they didn't. I don't know what they knew about that, so I cannot give a reply. I cannot reply to this. I think that they are both genocide, we can tell, but they are quite different in the dynamics of developing the operations. So I think they couldn't imagine something like that, especially because there was not a matter of a conquest of a territory. The territory had been conquered, so there were space and place for everybody. So it was difficult to understand this, to see before it happened, so to understand it before it happened, I guess. Hello.
I would like to return to the question about 1945 and the return of people coming, you know, the disorganization of Greece and the whole of Europe at the same time. But you know that Greece go into a situation of a civil war, which lasted between 45 and 51. And the little I know, I have friends who actually were in the resistance at that time, and all the contradictions about different views on what it is to be a human being. We are also very, very much present in Greece as everywhere between 1945 and 51. And then you brought up the questions of Jews coming back to Thessaloniki. They must have been part of these contradictions and these political
Yes, I talked about the Civil War, yes.
They were taking place in Europe at that time. And they are not very much talked about. Thank you.
If I may have kind of follow-up question. So the previous one concerning the Ottoman Empire and Armenian genocide, because as far as I know, when you talk about the racial anti-Semitism during the population exchange, that actually Jews in Greece in general, specifically Salonika, were kind of viewed in some quarters as sort of loyal to the Turks, almost in a sense, of the former Ottoman rulers. So I wonder if you can comment on that one.
Yes, but they were seen like that. They had difficulties because they had lived under the Ottoman rule for 4 centuries. So it was difficult for them to, and it was difficult for them. And at the same time, they were seen as traitors sometimes. But it was not true because they fought during the war. During the Italian, the war against the Italians, they were among the soldiers sent against the Italians, and they fought for Greece. So it was a gradual process of Hellenization, and maybe at the beginning it was like that.
Yeah, I wonder about, maybe I just fell out or something, but did you mention anything about the Greeks helping the Jewish, the community?
Some of them.
Because you said very little about that.
And,
because the little that I have read it seems that of course there was some anti-Semitism there too, but there were a lot of Greeks putting their lives on stake, helping the Jewish people.
In Athens, very much,
Also in Thessaloniki?
Yes. But we see about in the testimonies, we have some. I can't say that a few people stayed there. Much more in Athens or in other places in other islands, for example. But there are a few testimonies about that. There were, yes, of course, people was.
I believe that there were actually. I mean, of course, the whole world was in the war, and but I really do feel that from what I read, a lot of Greek people, because not only did a lot of the Jewish know good Greek, so they could sort of mingle and disappear, but
it was easier in Athens.
Yes.
Yeah, it was much easier in Athens.
But at the same time, they really put their lives at stake, and some went into the mountains.
Yes, with the Andartes. Yeah, some of them fled, but some of them also came back because of the family ties. If you read the testimonies, they talk about that. And if you think to the figures, in Athens it was easier because the city was bigger and the community was smaller, and there was the resistance movement very active. But it happened 1 year later.
Would you go more into that subject too, or more of the how much help they got?
Oh yes, I will. Maybe yes. No.
You mean now or in the masterpieces?
Now? Oh yes.
Later, when she goes.
Yeah.
And so.
One thing more. guy back here, like when the Jews came back, he sort of mentioned that they weren't very welcomed. But I mean, come on, Greece was in the civil war. They were trying the best they could to survive themselves right there and then. And I'm sure they would try to help them the much it was possible for them to help. I mean, I know people were dying of starvation also during this civil war. My father was lying late at night and couldn't sleep out of hunger and listening to other people dying out there. And I can just imagine, I mean, Greece today is sort of in a situation where you have all the refugees, yes, the refugees coming in, and the whole world is expecting them to take care of the situation. Well, whilst Greece is going down. I mean, come on, you know, really. So I think we should look at ourselves in this country, in our country here, how I'm half Greek, half Norwegian, that's why I'm saying it like this. And there were a lot of people helping, but there were a lot of people going against. So, and you know, we can't really judge. Right?
The matter is, how did they feel about that? They felt that they were extremely broken individuals. From what we called read, they had spent years in a concentration camp, and then in the displaced person camp. Then they came back and they had seen what the others couldn't imagine. From a psychological point of view, it was incredibly. Then there was economic side. And the Joint Distribution Committee, the ORT, the international organizations helped and helped them to rebuild their life. There are two different sides of the coins. Yeah.
Because, like I said, I'm half Greek, half Norwegian, but my Greek side has been.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm afraid going to be the last question before we start leaving.
Yeah.
I want to touch the most sensible thing. I'm from North Romania, Orthodox country. I know how the Orthodox Church in my country encouraged the government, fascist, Nazi in that time, to exterminate the Jewish, and even the Gypsy, who was Orthodox Christians. How the Orthodox Christian Church in Greek tried to save the Jewish? Was the same anti-Semite like in all Orthodox country?
It depended. Like there were Christians, Catholic who helped, and the Archbishop Damaskinos in Athens helped very much. And it depended on the church took a stand, but it didn't help, of course. It helped in Athens. In Athens it was easier because it was later and they had experienced what had happened in Salonika. There's a difference between Romania and Greece at the time.
So thank you all very much. Please join
me
to thank our speaker once again. And we have a little gift for someone who likes books. We have a couple of books related to the history of this country and the Holocaust.
Thank you very much.
And all of you, if you're interested to follow us, our events, we have a very thick book here, so you can put your email address and we put you on our mailing list. We'll send you all of
Sometimes. I don't want to talk about politics. That's why I didn't talk about
contemporary Greece.
Yeah.